It was a bright Monday morning when the court gathered for a case that would have otherwise gone unnoticed if not for one surprise detail. The lead representative for the plaintiff was none other than Denzel Washington. Yes, the Academy Award-winning actor, standing in a courtroom, briefcase in hand, preparing to argue in defense of a small underprivileged community that had suffered at the hands of a corporate giant. The courtroom was packed not only with legal professionals but with media members who had caught wind of this unique circumstance. Judge John Roberts, presiding over the proceedings, raised an eyebrow upon seeing Denzel walk confidently to the plaintiff's table. With a smirk, the Chief Justice greeted him formally, but a faint edge of amusement danced on his face. To him, this felt more like a stunt than a serious legal move. What Roberts didn't know, however, was that Denzel had been preparing for this very moment with relentless determination and a mind sharper than most expected. When the court came to order, the judge couldn't help but make a remark. "Mr. Washington, I hope you remember this isn't a movie set." Laughter bubbled in the room, light and patronizing. Denzel simply smiled, nodded, and replied, "I never forget where I am, Your Honor." Then he opened his binder and began presenting his opening argument. His tone was steady, professional, and compelling, not relying on theatrics but on meticulously researched facts. The courtroom atmosphere shifted, people leaned forward, listening. He laid out the timeline of violations committed by the corporation, including key documents that had mysteriously not been previously considered. As he spoke, his words held weight. He wasn't just an actor playing a lawyer, he had become a student of law, and his command over legal jargon and precedent cases stunned even the most seasoned observers. Judge Roberts watched with narrowed eyes, waiting for Denzel to stumble, to make a rookie error that would confirm his assumptions. But Denzel didn't falter. In fact, his citations were razor-sharp, pulling from federal regulations, court precedents, and even environmental statutes. He connected the corporation's practices to long-term health impacts on the local population, referencing specific cases the Supreme Court had ruled on in past decades. Roberts interrupted once to challenge the admissibility of an exhibit, and Denzel responded by referencing a ruling Roberts himself had authored in 2014. There was a pause. The judge blinked. The courtroom fell silent as people realized Denzel had just outmaneuvered the Chief Justice on legal grounds. It was subtle but powerful. It wasn't showmanship, it was mastery. Even the defense attorneys exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing that this case was going to be much tougher than they had anticipated. Denzel didn't just speak well, he listened better. As witnesses came forward, he cross-examined with surgical precision. One by one, corporate executives faltered under his questions, not because he was aggressive but because he was incredibly prepared. He brought up obscure reports, financial disclosures buried in hundreds of pages, and inconsistencies in public statements made by the company over the years. Every time the defense objected, Denzel calmly explained the relevance, backing it up with statutes and judicial interpretations. Even the stenographer, who had seen countless trials, later admitted to being in awe of Denzel's control over the courtroom. Roberts, trying to maintain neutrality, found himself frequently glancing at the legal brief Denzel had submitted to a document that, despite lacking a law firm's name, was airtight, organized, and deeply persuasive. During one heated moment, the defense tried to accuse Denzel of misleading the court by quoting data that they claimed was outdated. In response, Denzel pulled out a binder, turned to a tabbed page, and read from a government update published just days before the trial. The courtroom murmured in disbelief. He had anticipated their challenge. Judge Roberts leaned back in his chair, clearly impressed. This wasn't just a celebrity performance, this was a man who had poured himself into understanding every inch of the case, perhaps even more so than most practicing attorneys would have. And he did it not for fame or acclaim, but because he believed in the cause. His passion was quiet, his logic unbreakable. The media outside began shifting their tone from skepticism to admiration. Headlines changed from "Denzel's courtroom stunt" to "Denzel delivers a masterclass in justice." Roberts, now visibly more engaged, began probing the arguments more deeply. He asked nuanced questions that only someone truly fluent in legal doctrine could answer. Denzel, without missing a beat, addressed them thoughtfully, often connecting back to larger constitutional principles such as equal protection and due process. At one point, he invoked the 14th Amendment with a clarity that caught even the court clerks off guard. He wasn't just arguing, he was teaching. The law students in the back rows began taking notes, some realizing they were witnessing a once-in-a-lifetime moment. The judge, trying to maintain his role as neutral arbiter, started showing signs of genuine respect, occasionally nodding in acknowledgement of Denzel's well-structured replies. As the days progressed, it became evident that the tide was turning. The defense, once confident, grew desperate. Their arguments became shaky, and their responses to Denzel's cross-examinations felt increasingly defensive. Meanwhile, Denzel's presence grew stronger, his voice never rising, but his impact deepening with every word. He quoted from landmark cases, drew connections between corporate behavior and public harm, and highlighted the human cost of unchecked power. When he paused, the silence spoke volumes. The judge, no longer attempting sarcasm, asked questions with genuine curiosity. The courtroom that once doubted him now leaned into his every word. A transformation was happening, and not just in perception, but in the weight and meaning of justice itself. On the final day of trial, Denzel delivered his closing statement. It wasn't emotional, but it was unforgettable. He walked the court through the journey of the case, from the voices of the affected community to the failure of institutions meant to protect them. He pointed to facts, patterns, and legal doctrines, bringing everything together like a skilled architect. "This isn't just about laws and profits," he said, "it's about accountability. If those in power are never held responsible, what does justice even mean?" His words echoed through the chamber. Even Judge Roberts didn't interrupt. When Denzel ended, there was no applause, just a deep silence that carried more meaning than any clapping ever could. The judge took several weeks to reach a verdict. Rumors swirled that he was wrestling with how to word the ruling without making it seem like he'd been personally bested in court. But when the judgment was finally released, it was a resounding victory for the community Denzel represented. The corporation was held liable on multiple counts, and the court ordered restitution, cleanup efforts, and public apologies. Judge Roberts, in his written opinion, noted that the clarity and constitutional grounding presented by the plaintiff's counsel reminded this court of the power of informed civic advocacy. Though he never used Denzel's name, it was clear the praise was directed his way. The story made headlines nationwide. Legal experts weighed in, calling Denzel's court performance one of the most remarkable citizen-led efforts in recent history. Law schools began discussing the trial as a case study, and several professors reached out asking Denzel to speak to their students. Though he declined most public appearances, preferring the spotlight to remain on the community he had served, the impact of his work was undeniable. Judges, lawyers, and advocates across the country began referencing his methods. He had not just won a case, he had set a new precedent for what one individual could do when armed with knowledge, dedication, and a relentless pursuit of truth. Judge Roberts, in private circles, reportedly admitted he had underestimated Denzel. In a rare moment during a televised legal forum, he said, "Sometimes, the courtroom teaches you something you didn't expect." This case was one of those moments. While he didn't elaborate, those who had witnessed the trial understood exactly what he meant. It wasn't just about being wrong, it was about realizing that brilliance can come from unexpected places, and that the law, in its purest form, belongs to the people. The comment sparked a wave of discussions online, with many praising Roberts for showing humility and growth. Meanwhile, Denzel returned to his artistic work. But something had changed. He began supporting more civic education programs, funding legal scholarships for underrepresented students, and quietly contributing to public interest litigation efforts. He never boasted about the case, never sought awards or interviews. For him, the reward had been the result, and the lives he helped protect. And while he remained humble, Others did not let his legacy fade. The American Bar Association recognized his contribution to public legal education, and his trial transcripts became mandatory reading in several law programs. What began as doubt had turned into deep and lasting respect. Years later, people still speak of the day Judge Roberts tried to make light of Denzel Washington, only to find himself challenged and ultimately inspired. That courtroom moment became a metaphor used in countless speeches, the day tradition met transformation, and transformation won. Young students, especially from marginalized backgrounds, found hope in Denzel's journey that they too could study, rise, and speak truth to power. And for the legal community, it served as a reminder that the courtroom is not just for the credentialed, but for the committed. Denzel had walked in as an actor, but he walked out as a citizen advocate who changed the game. The case remains archived in legal databases under its formal name, but everyone remembers it differently. They call it the Washington trial, not for his fame, but for what he stood for. There's a plaque in the very courthouse where it happened, commemorating the outcome and the impact. And in Judge Roberts' chambers, they say there's still a copy of the final brief Denzel submitted, highlighted, bookmarked, and referenced time and again. For Roberts, it serves as both a professional touchstone and a personal lesson. Never judge a speaker by his profession, but by the strength of his argument and the sincerity of his cause. In the end, what made the case unforgettable wasn't just the legal brilliance, the media buzz, or the powerful verdict. It was the spirit behind it all. Denzel Washington stood not just for a community in pain, but for the idea that anyone, when equipped with truth and discipline, can challenge injustice. The story traveled across countries, translated into multiple languages, shared in classrooms, courtrooms, and conversations. It became legend not because of who won, but because of how it was won. With dignity, knowledge, and the unwavering belief that justice must be earned, not assumed. So the next time someone asks whether one person can make a difference, tell them about the courtroom where a judge tried to embarrass a man he thought was just an actor. Tell them how that actor responded not with drama, but with documents, not with anger, but with articulation. Tell them how the courtroom changed that day, and how the law grew just a little more accessible to everyone. Because sometimes, the hero doesn't wear a cape or carry a badge. Sometimes, he carries a binder, steps into court, and reminds even the highest judges what brilliance really looks like.